Hi everyone, I'm Rose and I'm a survivor of the sex industry, prostitution. I'll use those words interchangeably in my talk this evening. I wish I could be with you all in person this year. I so enjoyed being there last year and I have no doubt it will be a wonderful event this year as well. I'm grateful that I was able to record this video and be a virtual part of the evening at least. I do hope there isn't too much background noise in this recording. I'm recording it here on the quietest day of the week, but that doesn't mean it will be totally quiet. So I apologise if there is noise. Also apologise for the strange background, which was the best I could do at the moment. Thank you to the wonderful Amanda and for all she does in service of this issue, and all those at WEEP, the other speakers tonight, and everyone in attendance. It was great to hear that you had to move to the larger room. So, as you all know, there are many people who are in favour of the decriminalisation of this industry. Tonight I'll speak about why, in my survivor's view, prostitution is not legitimate work, and why decriminalisation does not improve conditions for women, although it does improve conditions for sex buyers and pimps. I'll submit to you tonight that the pro-sex work lobby should really be known as the pro-sex buyer and pimp lobby. I'll be talking mostly about sex buyers as men and sex sellers as women, since I'm a woman, and this is the most common scenario by a long way. The majority of people harmed in the sex trade are women and girls. But I don't mean to suggest by this that it's the only scenario, and I'm against prostitution in all forms, regardless of the sex of the sex buyer or seller. I also use the term work here because prostitution is labour, it is work in that sense, but it isn't legitimate work. In the words of the feminist Megan Tyler, it constitutes a form of unacceptable work. So, I was in this industry for 10 years in Canada. I documented some of my experiences in my book, Body Shell Girl, which was published in 2022. I actually spent the minority of my time in full service, to use the euphemism, brothels and escort. I was mostly in massage parlours and then massage outcall, which at the time in Ontario, Canada, were not full service. If I'd spent 10 years in a full service brothel, I cannot say that I'd be alive today. That should tell you something right off the bat about the legitimacy of this unacceptable work. I apologise that some of my language will be a little graphic, so if there are children in the room, it would be a good idea to take this opportunity to go outside for a few minutes. In thinking about this speech, I tried to avoid such language, but it turns out there isn't another way to express accurately what I want to say. We can't talk about prostitution without saying what it involves, although those on the side of decriminalisation like to do so. I talk quite a bit about my background and how I came to be in this industry at the WEEP event last year. You can also find my personal story online, as well as recounted in my book. For now, I'll just say that I got into this industry because I was broke and needed the money. This is the reason most of us get into it. So when we talk about this industry, we have to realise we're talking about an economically disadvantaged population that is tasked with providing this so-called service. Those in favour of decriminalisation love to point to the exceptions, but they are really the exceptions that prove the rule. One common argument those in favour of decrim will offer is that prostitution must be decriminalised so that women can report rapes and other assaults. Personally, I was raped in a decriminalised style brothel and I didn't report it. One reason why not is because there was then, and still is, just as much stigma surrounding brothel work when it's decriminalised, for the women that is. No matter how the pro-sex lobby tries to whitewash it, the fact is that most of them don't want their own daughters doing it, and decriminalisation doesn't change that attitude. But another more difficult reason I didn't report that rape was that it took me a long time to work out that it was rape. As I remember it, the most intensely distressing thought I couldn't get out of my head afterwards was this: was this rape really so different from all the other times I'd been penetrated by penises in this brothel? After all, none of them were wanted. What was wanted was the money the men gave me in exchange. Can a rapist leave you a tip and thereby have his rape resolved or absolved? This is basically how prostitution operates, and this is what feminists and survivors mean when they say the sex industry or prostitution is, quote, paid rape. I'm sometimes cautious with that statement because I recognise there are other situations in which people, especially women, have sex that they don't want to have, for example, to placate a partner. However, imagine doing that multiple times most days and with different men each time who you wouldn't dream of having unpaid sex with and who are in many cases physically or emotionally repulsive to you. Imagine having unwanted hands groping you and pinching you, and unwanted mouths all over you, and unwanted penises in your mouth and vagina again and again for hours in total on a standard brothel shift. Then add to that the necessity to pretend you're enjoying it, which most sex buyers demand either explicitly or implicitly, and some will get violent or complain to pimps, otherwise known as management in a decriminalised brothel, if you don't comply. Consider the physical, mental and emotional toll all this would take. This is what I mean when I say this industry is a trauma industry for women. I'm not talking about the worst individual sex buyers. I'm talking about the everyday violence, physical and emotional, of this industry. I fully agree with the proponents of decriminalisation that abuses should be reported. What I know, and they don't seem to, is that to do that, you need to report this whole industry. Nor can prostitution be made safe from a medical point of view, as the decrim lobby seems to think, or they say they think this. Condoms are not entirely effective, and many buyers will try to stealth them off. I've worked in decrim brothels where you're supposed to examine the buyer's penis under a lamp beforehand. This is not a solution because some conditions may be dormant at the time and the worst things you can catch don't show up in plain sight. Nor is compulsory testing for the women and not the sex buyers a solution. The fact is that as a person in the sex industry, your body is penetrated and exposed to other people's bodily fluids and the risk of disease. There is no way to make that safe. Another reason why working under a decriminalised system was worse in my experience was because prices go down, which means you have to service, to use the euphemism now, more men in order to make the same amount of money. Since prostitution is brutal on the body and exposes you to disease, my main aim when I was in the industry was to be actually penetrated by as few penises as possible. When I was working illegally, independently in an illegal context, both, I could negotiate with the sex buyer to do less. Working in a decriminalised brothel, however, you don't have this option. Depending on where you work, you may be penetrated by 10 or more men a night. You can't negotiate to do less, and you have to do it with every man who wants it. The sex buyer has more power over you when it's decriminalised because you are providing a service like any other, supposedly. So sex buyers can make complaints to pimps / management that they didn't get their money's worth or that you weren't enthusiastic enough, etc. If you think that's far-fetched, I can assure you that many men complain about this, and they are even more emboldened to do so in a decriminalised system. In fact, it's their right to do it. The customer is always right? If it's a job like any other. Laura McVeigh, who will be speaking shortly, has studied the comments men leave on discussion boards rating prostitutes in a legal and decriminalised context. So if you're interested in that topic, you could ask her about it. What the men say about us is shockingly violent and awful, and leaves no doubt that they do not consider us as human beings, and they certainly do not consider this a job like any other or legitimate work. Indigenous women and women of colour are also overrepresented in the sex trade, as well as women who are unhoused, women experiencing domestic abuse, women with mental illness, women who have suffered prior abuse, and women who suffer from addictions. Those who support decriminalisation support the sexual use and abuse of these women being decriminalised. If it were the daughters of politicians that were being abused in this industry, more politicians would be against the industry. So let's be clear on just who the decrim lobby is supporting the abuse of. They are not middle class and higher women like so many decriminalisation supporters are themselves. The decrim lobby supports the use and abuse of other, far less privileged women. I'll approach the end of my talk here tonight by adding that once you're in this industry, it can be extremely difficult to get out. The industry is like quicksand, and women get trapped in the cycle of trauma. Personally, I did not set out to spend 10 years in the sex industry. Briefly, I can say that my self-worth plummeted as a result of this industry and the trauma I suffered in it. It became harder and harder to see any kind of future for myself. Additionally, the longer I stayed in, the worse my other employment options got. I became convinced that I would die at the age of 36. Now there really was no point trying to build any kind of future for myself. I know now that having a sense of a foreshortened future is a symptom of PTSD, but I didn't know that at the time. At the time, in fact, I was gaslit by sex work ideology into thinking nothing really bad had happened to me, nothing to see here, as the sex buyer and pimp lobby would have us believe. But my body and soul knew otherwise. When I finally did get out, life got even worse. Because of my unrecognised trauma, I descended even further into alcoholism and addiction, and got involved with another violent man who I hoped would kill me, and he nearly did. I'd finally left prostitution, but I hadn't left the effects of it. And even though my life is a lot different today, 17 years after I got out, I still haven't left the effects of it. Even though I'm one of the very lucky ones in so many ways, the industry has scarred me deeply and affected my life in far-reaching ways. And there are so many things that many take for granted that have simply passed me by. I will never experience them. I refuse to be defined by my time in this industry, but I cannot ignore its severe effects either. I speak out so that we may fight to save other women and girls from its harms. In conclusion, when you hear people talk about decriminalisation and what a good idea it is, remind them what they're really talking about. Remind them that prostitution cannot be made safe for women because it is inherently unsafe. Remind them of the biological realities. Point out that decriminalisation helps not women in the industry, but sex buyers and pimps. Is that who they want to support? Do they want to be known as the champions of sex buyers and pimps? Remind them that decriminalisation means decriminalising the abuse of marginalised women, women who are not there because they chose to be. Encourage them to seek out the stories of survivors of this industry who tell it like it is. Amanda, as well as other speakers here tonight, can direct you to these resources. I wish I was there this evening to chat with some of you afterwards. Since I'm not, if you want to get in touch with me, just ask Amanda and she'll give you my email, or you can find me online in the usual social media places and contact me that way. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you finally from me and all survivors of this industry for taking time out of your busy lives to be here tonight and for supporting the Nordic Model and opposing the decriminalisation of the sex industry, prostitution. Thank you.